Hey everybody, I want to do chapter 25 now. So let's go into a screen share and let's talk about ergogenetic aids. All right, so we're going to cover several different categories here on this last lecture, if I can ever make it start. You know, what are we looking at? We're trying to figure out what can improve performance, right? So we want to improve what work we can do and basically perform better. So how do we do that? Is it nutrition? Is it drugs? Is it warm up? Is it stress management? Is it blood doping? You know, what is it? So there's a lot of research out there to figure out how to make people perform better and do more. So when we look at the research part of it, we're looking at, how much of whatever we're studying. If it's too low, too little, too much, it may show or not show an improvement or effect. It may have an effect on those that are trained versus untrained. When we look at the value of what is different, the value is going to be somewhat intrinsic. So every individual may define that a little differently. What is it that we're trying to do? Is this a short term? Is this an endurance event? Is it fine motor activity? Is it large muscle groups? So what might help in a short term activity or event, it may actually have detrimental effects on long-term performance. So we just have to look at what it is we're doing. Like any good research, we're going to look at placebo versus the actual. What the individual believes is going to happen may influence performance. And if it's a placebo, it really should do nothing to improve performance. Optimally, when we look at research, it's double-blind studies. Neither the individuals participating nor the investigators who know who's getting the treatment per se and who's having the placebo. So again, if we look at performance and we're looking at anabolic steroids, we can see where the actual steroid changes the amount of weight lifted versus the control may have some ups and downs. And with training, you'll see they gradually increase, but not nearly to the same speed of change as those that are juicing. So when we start looking at different things, we have to look at where the evidence is. Overall, there's little evidence existing that says dietary supplements can improve performance, except for creatine, okay? Despite the fact that there's little evidence, 80% of athletes use supplements, which it is a crazy, I don't know how many millions of dollars people spend per year, but for something that doesn't necessarily show improvement, it is subjectively considered to be very important. Thing that we have to look at is there's not a lot of regulation on dietary supplements. So what you think you're taking, you may or may not be taking. You have to look at, depending on who's manufacturing, there could be trace contaminants in there with an anabolic steroid, and it'll shoot off a hot drug test. So keep that in mind. You don't necessarily know where things are coming from and how they're being made. So these next two screens just go through a huge chart of what kind of supplements are out there, what it says it does, and what evidence it may have to show. And then comments, what do we really need? What don't we need? So like looking at this overall, the evidence is poor as far as what the actual benefit is. Again, creatine is going to be an exception to that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the creatine as we go. But, there's a whole market out there that shows us what is happening. When we look at creatine, short-term explosive exercises, it can help. So the supplementation increases those muscle creatine levels. You're going to see a ton of people lifting weights that are taking their creatine supplements while they're doing it. We might have a period of time where we load it, and then there'll be a maintenance dose. So it will increase the muscle mass. Might be more because we're retaining more water than actual protein synthesis. If we looked at this creatine, it may actually negatively affect performance in runners. So those are all things to consider. As with everything else, we've got side effects. Gastrointestinal distress, nausea, and cramping might not be awesome. Should creatine be banned? I don't know. The research says that doing that seems to be no really different than carb supplementation with endurance performance. So maybe we might see benefit with myopathy conditions, problems, dysfunctions of the muscle. So muscular dystrophies may benefit from some supplementation. But it can also have negative effects if we're looking at metabolic myopathies. So I don't know. I just can't see that there is a ton of benefit that can outweigh the costs. Do we supplement with oxygen during exercise? It would increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. If we were in a hyperbaric chamber, it doesn't actually provide any evidence of improved performance, as it might show an improved time to exhaustion, but is probably not going to make a huge long-term difference. Oxygen breathing prior to exercise, we look at as we're trying to store it up. We really can't improve the oxygen bound to hemoglobin. We're at 97% at rest. So, that 3% is probably not going to be the make or break. We can increase the dissolved oxygen in the blood. However, the first couple breaths, it goes back to normal. So, there's very limited evidence that O2 breathing prior to exercise will improve short-term exercise performance. It has to be within 2 minutes of the event, and it's just not going to be practical. You're not going to go to the line, with a face full of oxygen trying to pre-do before you race. Why are they looking at trying to breathe the oxygen during exercise? So we can prevent muscle hypoxia. It doesn't necessarily change oxygen delivery to the muscle. You might see this help for athletes who really desaturate during activity, but how are you going to do this during performance? You're not. After exercise, we're going to look at it as it's just supposed to speed up recovery and get ready for a second bout. A lot of the early evidence said, hey, we think this helps, and later recognized there's no real improvement. Blood doping. If we're looking at trying to improve endurance performance, if we infuse the body with red blood cells, so we can increase hemoglobin concentration, so we have a better capacity to carry oxygen. You can do this through matched blood or using their subject's own blood. You're going to see an effect that lasts 10 to 12 weeks. And an improvement in performance can be anywhere from 3 to 34%. It's not going to be legal for athletes to blood dope. And you can see how long the effect lasts, but it peaks right around that first 4 weeks. So if we look at this EPO, is a hormone that'll stimulate red blood cell production. So we are going to see this as part of a chemotherapy or a dialysis patient. If we have too many red blood cells, we can die. So it has been known to cause very detrimental side effects. You can't always tell with a snapshot that maybe we're seeing a difference. So a lot of times there's almost a passport, blood history that follows individuals at high levels of competition so that we can see if something's dramatically different. So yes, it can improve that VO2 max and endurance performance, but it is not legal. Remember Lance Armstrong? This is where some of it came into play. Anaerobic performance. If we're looking at buffering hydrogen release from the muscles, we talked about sodium bicarbonate as being a huge blood buffer. Yeah, it may show improvements in performance, lasting 1 to 10 minutes, or repeated bouts of high intensity exercise. It will not improve anything that is a task that lasts less than a minute. If we're looking at the optimal dose here, it's going to be 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight with 1 liter of water. You're going to see large doses can lead to side effects, diarrhea and vomiting, but does it really help that much? Maybe. So depending on training wise, what you're trying to do, but you're looking at trying to maintain an intensity of that 1 to 10 minutes. Amphetamines. Biggest thing they're going to do is cause increased arousal and perception of increased energy and self-confidence, might extend some time to exhaustion. Really is only going to help if you're already fatigued to start. If you're alert and you're adequately rested, you're not going to see an improvement. When we look at these beta-2 agonistics, we're looking at asthma, right? We're looking at different things that can generally exist to improve airway resistance in asthmatics. Clenbuterol is an anabolic agent. We're going to see a 10 to 20% increase in muscle mass. We're going to type 1 to type 2 fiber conversion. Be used by athletes in power events. Salbutamol is ingested to improve performance in supramaximal exercise. Both of these things are going to be associated with severe side effects. We know that we have asthmatics that exercise. So both of these are going to get through the agencies that monitor intake and doping activities, but they're only to be consumed in therapeutic doses where people trying to use these to increase power are probably not maintaining those therapeutic levels. Caffeine can improve performance at the muscle or nervous system. It can also improve delivery of fuel to a muscle. We can see a decrease in feeling fatigue, a lower RPE during prolonged exercise. We can elevate our blood glucose and increase our fat utilization. Really depends on the dose relationship and what the variable is. If we are a habitual caffeine user, we may see very little change. If you're somebody who doesn't ever have caffeine, some caffeine is a lot. Recognize that there could be side effects: insomnia, diarrhea, anxiety, irritability. There can be a diuretic effect, meaning pull some of the water out. So everybody responds a little differently to something like caffeine. So you really have to have an idea what you're doing. sources of caffeine, you can see brewed tea has a bunch, coffee absolutely has a ton, soft drinks have some. What's interesting is look at Excedrin for headaches. It's a huge dose of caffeine is what it really is. So we might see an effect on the central nervous system, on heart rate, and, skeletal muscle, and how much we can mobilize that glucose and fat. So again, yes, we might see some improvement. Definitely seems to be dose related. And if we're already habitual caffeine users, we might not see much difference. All you'll see is without it, most people have a headache. Cycling is going to be, we've talked a little bit about running form and activity, but cycling is definitely going to be a little dependent on the equipment. The ergonomics of cycling, drag, resistance, all of those play a huge part. So if we look at it, faster speeds are going to increase your drag. Faster speeds result in a much higher power requirement. So we have to be able to work more. So how do we get rid of some of the drag and improve performance? Might be body positioning, equipment and clothing, race strategy, drafting becomes a big part of it. I don't know how many of you have actually been on a road bike. They can clip their pedals in. They're designed to fit each individual user. You're going to see those bikes go upward of 20 or 30 miles an hour. Been on one once and it scared the crap out of me. Give me my totally resistance, amped up resistant, totally crappy mountain bike, but I feel much more comfortable that I won't go so fast as to kill myself. But you will see some of those road bikes as being amazing. Some of it is the basis of the frame. It's more like a teardrop shape. If it's a stiffer carbon, it'll have more power transfer. The wheels have different levels of drag. So we might want flat disc wheels and 3-4 spoke carbon fibers to have the least amount of drag. The tires and the rolling resistance, if the tire is deformed or we have an area in contact with the road, we might see changes. If you've got relatively flat tires, you're probably going to have more rolling resistance versus high pressure tires. The cranks, the handlebars, the seat positioning all play a role here. The drag produced by the cyclist body is 75 to 80% of the drag produced. If we lower the position, we change the handlebars, we can maybe reduce that 30 to 35%. That's a big number. Clothing, tight fitting, bikers have very specific outfits if they're serious about it. And there's a reason for that. Cycling shoes and the pedals where they clip in allow us to transfer the power better. Nothing scares me more than clipping my feet into a bike that can go 30 miles an hour downhill and not be able to put my feet down as I try and stop. So again, comfort is something you really look at. Drafting. That lead cyclist can reduce the air resistance for the person behind them by 30%. If you're riding at the back of a pack, you can actually reduce drag almost 40%. So really can conserve energy there. So different positions, different handlebars, all of that plays a role. So again, you see the group go, and the reason for that is, that resistance and drag is huge. Talk a little bit about a warm-up. It can be physiological or psychological. Being warmed up and prepared may improve performance. We increase our focus, our perception, how engaged we are, our muscle mass is at the right temperature. We want our warm-up to be pretty identical to performance. We don't want to warm up riding a bike when we're going to run. It should be a generalized activity. If we're looking at recommendations for short-term performances, something less than 10% effort, warm up at 40 to 60% of VO2 max for 5 to 10 minutes, have a 5-minute recovery. Intermediate term performances, anywhere from 10 seconds to less than 5 minutes. Again, we want to warm up a little harder, have less than a 5-minute recovery. We want to go in and start a performance with a slightly elevated VO2. So that way we're already kind of transitioning ourselves into steady state, right? Long-term performances, we want to be warmed up at 60 to 70% VO2 max for 5 to 10 minutes. If we go too hard or too long, we might deplete our muscle glycogen, or already place us in a position of thermal strain. So keep that in mind. Stretching. We want to increase joint flexibility. Is the muscle tendon compliance going to be there? Do you feel limber? We want to say stretching helps reduce the risk of injury. There's a little support to that. I guess I would look at it as we want to do some dynamic stretching prior to activity, but stretching right before the exercise, we're not going to increase, joint mechanics at that point. We probably have a much better shot of stretching outside, especially if we're looking more at like that static stretching outside of the competition and warm up kind of phase. There'll be, with static stretching, you will see a period of time where we lose a little power. And that is the nature of attempting to change the muscle fibers. So with that being said, we don't necessarily want to do a whole bunch of prolonged static holds right before our activity because we're not going to have the same power. That kind of mobility to improve that joint flexibility is something that should take place outside. I think most of the research says you have almost a 12-hour decrease in power output following static stretching. So, covered a bunch of different things here, but what we're really looking at is how do we improve what we're trying to do for the overall, okay? So some things we can do actually help. Some things we do because we just want to say we're doing something and we think it might help. I'm going to also be a person, and as long as there's not a negative effect that I think it helped, it might be all the help you're going to get. That placebo effect of it didn't really change anything, but I felt better doing it. I don't know that you can argue that that's a detriment overall. As long as you're not doing stupid stuff and hurting yourself, if you think it's helping, maybe it is. All right. So that takes care of all of the regular content. Ooh, how exciting. We'll talk in office hours about what to expect on the fun. All right. But you've covered the book. How exciting.